Hunchback of Notre Dame by Victor Hugo. On the morning of the 6th of January, 1482, the Parisians were awakened by a grand peal from all the bells within the triple enclosure of the city, the university, and the town. This 6th of January was a double holiday, united since time immemorial, the Epiphany, or Feast of the Kings, and the Feast of the Fools. To celebrate such a day, there was to be a bonfire kindled on the Place de Grève and a maypole raised at the Chapelle de Braque. A mystery play was to be performed in the great hall of the Palace of Justice, and it was known that the Flemish ambassadors, who had arrived 2 days previously to conclude the marriage treaty between the last Dauphin and Margaret of Flanders, intended to be present not only at the performance of the mystery, but also at the election of the Fool's Pope, which was likewise to take place there. On that day it was no easy matter to make one's way into the great hall. The open square in front of the palace thronged with people. This entertainment was to be given, according to ancient customs, on the marble table where all the preparations had been made since the morning. The play was not to begin until the great clock of the palace had chimed the last stroke announcing noon. And when the clock struck 12, there was a great shuffling about, a great movement of feet and heads, a general detonation of coughing and blowing of noses. Each one arranged himself, posted himself to the best advantage, raised himself on his toes. Then there was a deep silence, every neck remaining outstretched, every mouth open, every eye turned towards the marble table. But nothing appeared. The bailiff's 4 sergeants still kept their posts, as stiff and motionless as if they had been 4 painted statues. All eyes then turned toward the gallery reserved for the Flemish envoys. The door remained shut, and the gallery empty. They waited 1, 2, 3, 5 minutes, a quarter of an hour, but nothing came. The multitude clapped their hands. "The mystery!" they all shouted, "and let Flanders go to all the devils!" This was enough. A music of high and low-keyed instruments now struck up underneath the stage. The hangings were lifted, and 4 characters in motley attire, with painted faces, issued forth, drew up in line before the audience, whom they saluted with a profound obeisance, whereupon the musical sound ceased, and the mystery began. In all that assemblage, upon which the 4 allegorical personages seemed to be striving to see which could pour out the most copious floods of metaphor, no ear was so attentive, no heart so palpitating, no eye so eager, no neck so outstretched, as were the eye, ear, neck, and heart of the author of the play, the poet, the brave young man, Pierre Gringoire. He had retired behind his pillar, and there it was that he listened, looked, and enjoyed. It pains us to relate, this first ecstasy was very soon disturbed. The door of the reserved gallery, which had until then been so inopportunely shut, inopportunely opened, and the stentorian voice of the usher abruptly announced, "His Eminence, the Cardinal of Bourbon!" The Flemish embassy made its appearance in the gallery behind the cardinal. The bailiff advanced to the edge of the gallery and shouted, after procuring silence by a motion of his hand, "Townsmen, householders, and inhabitants! To satisfy those who will that the play should begin again, and those who will that it should continue, His Eminence orders that it shall go on." The characters on the stage accordingly took up their text where they had left off, and Gringoire hoped that at least the remainder of his composition would be listened to. This hope, however, was soon dispelled like the rest of his illusions. The actors were going on bravely, when one of the Flemish party rose suddenly, and Gringoire heard him deliver, in the midst of the universal attention to his piece, this abominable harangue. "Monsieur the citizens and squires of Paris, by the Holy Rood, I know not what we be doing here. I do indeed see, down in that corner upon that stage, some people who look as if they wanted to fight. I know not whether that be what ye call a mystery, but I know that it is not amusing. This is not what I was told it was to be. I had been promised the Feast of Fools with an election of the Lord of Misrule. We at Ghent too have our Fool's Pope, and in that by the Rood we're behind nobody. But we do thus. A mob comes together, as here for instance, then each in his turn goes and puts his head through a hole and makes faces at the others. He who makes the ugliest face, according to general acclamation, is chosen Pope. That's our way, and it's very diverting. Shall we make your Pope after the fashion of my country? Gringoire would fain have replied, but amazement, resentment, and indignation deprived him of utterance. Besides, the motion was received with such enthusiasm by those townsfolk, flattered at being called squires, that all resistance would have been unavailing. All he could do now was to go with the stream. In the twinkling of any eye, everything was ready for putting the idea into execution. Townspeople, students, and clerks had all set themselves to work. The small chapel, situated opposite to the marble table, was fixed upon to be the scene of the grimaces. The glass, being broken out of one of the divisions of the pretty rose-shaped window over the doorway, left free a circle of stone through which it was agreed that the candidates should pass their heads. The grimaces commenced. The first face appeared at the hole, then a second face, and a third succeeded, then another, then another, the spectators each time laughing and stamping their feet with delight. The scene became more and more Flemish. The great hall had become, as it were, one vast furnace of audacity and joviality, in which every mouth was a shout, every face a grimace, every figure a posture, the sum total howling and roaring. Suddenly there was a great thunder of applause, mingled with prodigious exclamations. The Lord of Misrule was at last elected. It was indeed a miraculous grin that now beamed through the Gothic aperture, a tetrahedron nose, a horseshoe mouth, a small left eye overshadowed by a red bushy brow, while the right eye disappeared entirely under a monstrous wart. Straggling teeth with breaches here and there, like the battlements of a fortress, a horny lip, over which one of those teeth projected like the tusk of an elephant, a forked chin, and above all an expression diffused over the whole, a mixture of malice, astonishment, and melancholy. The acclamation was unanimous. The crowd precipitated itself towards the chapel, and the happy Lord of Misrule was led out in triumph. And now the surprise and admiration of the people redoubled. They found the wondrous grin to be but his ordinary face, or rather his whole person was a grimace. His large head was bristling with red hair. Between his shoulders was an enormous hump, to which he had a corresponding projection in front, a framework of thighs and legs so strangely gone astray that they touched only at the knees, and when viewed in front looked like two sickles joined together by the handles. Sprawling feet, monstrous hands, and yet with all that deformity a certain awe-inspiring vigour, agility, and courage. In all, a strange exception to the everlasting rule which prescribes that strength, like beauty, shall result from harmony. Such was the Pope whom the fools had just chosen. When this sort of Cyclops appeared on the threshold of the chapel, motionless, squat, almost as broad as he was high, the populace recognized him at once by his coat, half red and half violet, figured over with little silver bells, and still more by the perfection of his ugliness, and exclaimed with one voice, "It's Quasimodo, the bell-ringer! It's Quasimodo, the Hunchback of Notre Dame!" During all this scene, Gringoire and his piece had held out. His actors, goaded on by himself, had not ceased spouting their parts, nor had he ceased to listen. But when he saw Quasimodo and the noisy train of the fool's Pope march with great clamour out of the hall, the rest of the crowd rushing eagerly after them, he made his retreat, hanging his head, the last in the field, like a general who has fought well. The night comes on early in January. The streets were already growing dark when Gringoire quitted the palace. He took a resolution to go to the Place de Grève. At least, thought he, I shall perhaps get a brand to warm my fingers at the bonfire, and I shall manage to sup on some morsel from the public refectory. Accordingly, he hurried towards the fire, which burnt magnificently in the middle of the place. A considerable crowd, however, encircled it. In a wide space left clear between the fire and the crowd, a young girl was dancing. Whether she was a human being, a fairy, or an angel, was what Gringoire, sceptical philosopher and ironical poet as he was, could not at the first moment decide, so much was he fascinated by this dazzling vision. She was not tall, but the elasticity of her slender shape made her appear so. She was a brunette, but it was obvious that in the daylight her complexion would have that golden gleam seen upon the women of Spain and of Rome. Every look was fixed upon her, Every mouth was open in the circle about her, and indeed, while she danced to the sound of the tambourine, which her round and delicate arms lifted above her head, slender, fragile, active as a wasp, with a golden girdle without a fold, her skirt of varied colours swelling out below her slender waist, giving momentary glimpses of her fine-formed legs, her rounded, bare shoulders, her black hair and her sparkling eyes, she looked like something more than human. Among the 1,000 faces tinged by the scarlet light, there was one which seemed to be more than all the rest absorbed in the contemplation of the dancer. It was the face of a man, austere, calm, and sombre. This man, whose costume was hidden by the crowd that surrounded him, seemed to be not more than 35 years of age, yet he was bald, having only a few thin tufts of hair about his temples, which were already grey. His broad and high forehead was beginning to be furrowed with wrinkles, but in his deep-set eyes there shone an extraordinary youth, an intense animation, a depth of passion. He kept them constantly fixed upon the gypsy, and while the young girl of 16 danced and swayed to the delight of all, his reverie seemed to grow more and more gloomy. From time to time a smile and a sigh met each other on his lips, but the smile was far more sad than the sigh. The girl, breathless, stopped at last, while the crowd lovingly applauded. "Jolly!" cried the gypsy. Gringoire then saw come up to her a little white goat, alert, brisk, and glossy, with gilt horns, gilt hoofs, and a gilt collar, which he had not before observed. "Jolly," said the dancer, "it's your turn now." And sitting down, she gracefully held out her tambourine to the goat. "Jolly," she continued, "what month of the year is this?" The animal lifted its forefoot and struck once upon the tambourine. It was, in fact, the first month of the year. The crowd applauded. "Jolly," said the gypsy, with a new turn of the tambourine, "what hour of the day is it?" Jolly struck 7 strokes, and at that very moment the clock of the Maison aux Piliers rang 7. The people were wonderstruck. "There is witchcraft in all that," said a sinister voice in the crowd. It was that of the bald man who had his eyes constantly upon the gypsy. She shuddered and turned around, but the applause burst forth again and smothered the sinister exclamation. The attention of everyone was diverted at that moment by the procession of the Fool's Pope, which, after traversing many a street and square, was now pouring into the Place de Grève with all its torches and all its clamour. This procession had increased on the way, having enlisted all the ragamuffins, the unemployed thieves and idle scamps in Paris, so that when it reached the Grève it presented quite a respectable aspect. It is not easy to give an idea of the expression of proud and beatific joy which the melancholy and hideous visage of Quasimodo had attained in the journey. It was the first thrill of vanity that he had ever experienced. He had hitherto experienced nothing but humiliation, disdain at his condition, and disgust for his person. So, deaf as he was, he nevertheless relished, like a true pope, the acclamations of that crowd whom he had hated, because he felt himself hated by them. What though his people were a gathering of fools, of cripples, thieves, and beggars, still they were a people, and he was a sovereign. Around that dismal and unhappy countenance there was a perfect radiance. It was therefore not without surprise and alarm that all at once a man was seen to dart from the crowd, and with an angry gesture snatch from Quasimodo's hands the crozier of gilt wood, ensign of his mock papacy. The person who had this temerity was the man with the bald head, who the moment before had been standing in the crowd that encircled the gypsy. Now it could be seen that he was in ecclesiastical dress. The moment he rushed forth from the crowd, he was recognized by Gringoire, who had not before observed him. "What?" said he with a cry of astonishment. "Why, 'tis Dom Claude Frollo, the archdeacon. What the devil can he want with that one-eyed brute? He'll be devoured." A cry of terror proceeded from the multitude. The formidable Quasimodo had leapt down from his seat, and the women turned away their eyes that they might not see him tear the archdeacon to pieces. He made one bound toward the priest, looked in his face, and then fell on his knees before him.